rush further through our extensive program. And it's interesting that the input news from Sweden and from Denmark were so different and so informative in different ways. And we are now waiting for the updated input from Finland by Professor Emeritus Eero Vuorio from the University of Turku and also director of the Biocenter Finland. And he says that he's totally retired, but still totally active. And as we have the pleasure of having you on the program board, we know that you are still totally active. So please, Eero Vuorio.
Thank you. So this is one that we... This, well, thank you, Marit. Being a retired person, I feel a little humble to address you and try to give you an update of what's happening in Finland. I think, you know, in your own country, you are kind of disposed to the outer circle when you are retired. The neighboring countries don't care about that. Therefore, I actually asked Anu Jalanko, whom you probably all know. She's the national coordinator of BBMRI.fi, the national biobank network in Finland, for PowerPoint. So the basis of this presentation is hers. But I changed everything. I skipped about 45–50% of the slides away, and I rephrased them. So I take full responsibility what's up there, but still, I think this is reflecting when she gave an essentially similar presentation. I could summarize by saying that almost every bit and piece of the whole national scene is on the move right now. It's amazing that all things happen at the same time after so many years when nothing much happened at all. On the other hand, I could summarize much the same way as Camilla Stoltenberg said a while ago, and almost everybody, that the opportunities, challenges, and the solutions in Finland seem to be going more or less in the same way as they do in Norway, Denmark, Sweden. So altogether, we are approaching a similar goal, but of course with from our roots a little bit. So I will actually run through a number of, number of points, only 1 or 2 PowerPoints per, just to kind of give you an update of how things are moving. Probably at the end of it, you are even more confused than you are now, but I'll try to summarize then at least one way. One of the really kind of interesting background information is that there is really a major health and social care reform in Finland, the so-called SOTE reform, which is really one of the biggest administrative and operative overhauls of the entire system in Finland ever. The customer kind of oriented freedom is one of the keys, and of course the municipalities will still have the responsibilities of providing this service. To reach something like this, it obviously we have to have a totally different way of exchanging information between all the different healthcare units. Customers can't go to any place else if they don't have their records with them. But this is only the background. A very interesting kind of document is, well, it's more than a document, it's really a strategy, the health sector growth strategy, which oftentimes goes with the name of Mikko Alkio. He's a lawyer, and he's very well politically connected, and it came up with some very straightforward ideas of how to make the Finnish healthcare system, its kind of use also for commercial applications, competitive in the world. What was probably the most important one is that this was a collaborative effort of 3 ministries. So the driver, in my opinion, was the Ministry of Economic Affairs and Employment, who usually are the ones who have the money. The Ministry of Education and Culture, who are supposed to support research, and the Ministry of Health, and social affairs, or social affairs and health, who never have any research money. So together, these three ministries really came up with a plan, which I think, or a strategy, and one could say that many of the developments in Finland actually are based on this growth strategy. I will not go into the details as such, but I think the consequences is probably what's really more important. One of the consequences is that there is essentially a little bit of a separate spin-off type of activity, establishment of a national genome strategy. In fact, it proposes that we establish a national genome center, which is somewhat embarrassing because about 15, 20 years ago we had such an institution. At that time it was based in the University of Helsinki in what became FIM, the Finnish Institute for Molecular Medicine, and it was essentially a genomic center, a sequencing center. That was then discontinued when FIM started, and now they kind of re-establish it. But now the tasks are much different. It's like to become a national reference database of genomes and genome variants. And I started to boldface that one of the driving themes or cross-cutting themes of all these proposals is that they are looking for single points of contact, single service approach in many of these strategies. And you can read that there's a whole range of tasks proposed for this National Genome Center. However, it's not really in existence in today's world. To implement something like this, the availability and efficient usage of all the different registries, and I would claim that having listened to the other presentations, the situation in Finland is pretty much the same. Social security number from the 60s, first cohort started also in 60s, a lot of different registries where people, the citizens, do not even know that their data is stored, but they are totally dispersed. So it's just the opposite of what Mats was telling for Denmark. There is remarkable resistance in some of these registries to actually allow data to be used for research purposes, and it is quite clear that in many cases, even when it's actually doable, the time frame of getting access to the different types of registries, we talk about months, sometimes even a year. And I think Mikko Alkio, among others, was able to tell the ministries, the decision makers, that this is no way to try to be competitive in today's world. Pharma companies have a time frame which is totally different from having to wait for this type of information for months, if not a year. Therefore, currently there is a reform of the existing legislation concerning the different health-related registries in Finland, and the targeted outcomes are quite clear. The whole act must be modernized. There must be a centralized patient document archive for research purposes, and also the important issue, of course, is that the second use of all research data for secondary purposes is really one of the important issue, and you will be coming across this same term, single service operator, one-stop shop model over and over again when we go through my PowerPoints. Now, to get some momentum to this one, the ministry was, interestingly enough, they gave some money even to the establishment of the Genome Center, even though there is really no legal base for that yet. So at least they want to get things started at this point. However, it's likely that the whole legal framework for the implementation of the genome strategy will not be ready until maybe fall next year. And at that time, the Finnish Biobank Act, which I think many people have been quite happy with, actually will see some revisions as well. And now I actually get to what I was asked to talk. Give you a little bit of an update as to how is the biobanking situation in Finland. But I hope that you understand that all these other things are kind of related to it, contributing to it, and I really don't think I could give you a comprehensive view of what's going on if I didn't tell them that. So, 2013 we got the Finnish Biobank legislation. The research community was very paranoid and hesitant and really disliked it until the implementation started. And I think most of the Finnish scientists that you meet today would say that this is a very, very nice act. And it's among the best in the world. Because it, for instance, gave the possibility of transferring all the existing sample and data collections from the hospital districts to a biobank. And at the same time, it became then under a completely different legislation, which allowed much more expedited use of samples and data related to samples as well. And it had the major advantage that it could be immediately linked to all the electronic health records related to the sample. This required registration of the biobanks, and as you know, this was essentially that all samples were transferred to the biobank. There was public announcements, like in newspapers, of telling people that you can opt out. Not many people did that. It's a kind of Scandinavian tradition, I believe, or Nordic tradition. But of course, the protection of the individuals is still very strong. Anyway, I will show you very soon what the current situation is about biobanking. The legislation also gives a possibility to recontact, and it also deals with the options of how to collaborate with industry. And of course, the collection of samples and data, new samples and data from healthcare is also part of it, and the electronic health records I already mentioned. Let's look at this picture a little bit bigger. So today, as probably was expected, Finland has 8 registered biobanks. 8 is not much, but I think 8 is more or less the right number. The colored areas here are actually the central university hospital districts, plus Jyväskylä in central Finland, which is a very big hospital, but they do not have a medical faculty. But so these are the kind of custodians of the diagnostic paraffin samples, and of course all other samples that come from the individuals part of their healthcare. And then there are 2 national biobanks. One is the THL Biobank, which essentially hosts all the cohort study samples and data related to that. The other one is the Finnish Hematological Biobank, which is in the Finnish Red Cross, I think mainly in Helsinki as well. The registration and the application for a biobank is a fairly complicated process, and I do not really expect to have too many new ones. There are some, I mean, I personally sit on the board of the Finnish Cancer Foundation, and they used to have a sizable operation with laboratories where they did diagnostics. And I think we calculated they have between 2.5 or 3 million samples, largely paraffin blocks, and they're not exactly sure whether they are valuable enough to be transferred to a biobank or whether they really should set up a biobank. But that's a major cost item for a foundation, and they would actually cutting their distribution of funding considerably. So in that respect, I think the situation is rather stabilized, I would say. I think this one I probably more or less said. The samples and data can be and have been transferred to a biobank, public announcement, possibility to opt out, and these are of course diagnostic samples in the sense that they still serve a dual purpose. The biobank cannot really give out the last bit of a piece of whatever sample they have, because there is possibility of need to re-investigate that particular sample if the patient is alive and there is a medical reason to analyze it. And of course, there is the broad consent of just giving a sample for biobank purposes is available. And there is, of course, the other way around too, then the obligation to provide data back to the individuals who would like to know more about it. This is obviously easy to say, but it's very difficult to really implement. I don't think it has really been tested so far. So this was Anu's summary of what is the situation in Finland nowadays. With the 8 biobanks, the number of paraffin-embedded tissue sections was so that about 2.5 million individuals had contributed to such samples, and her estimate, I don't know why this goes so rapidly, is that we would be getting close to 3 million by the end of this year, which would be about more or less in the same ballpark. About half of the population already is in a biobank. And the numbers for DNA samples, plasma, biomarker analysis, GWASs, and so on, I think, again, these are more or less in the same ballpark with the other Nordic countries, which seems essentially is indicating that although we have probably taken different routes, things are, what I would say, extremely good shape compared to any other international competitor that we would have. Now, meanwhile, these 8 biobanks have, under the umbrella of BBMRI.fi, been starting to work together. They have agreed that all the access procedures documents are transparent. They all can see each other's, and this has made the joining of the biobanks more recently much more easy, because they can learn from the mistakes of the first ones. All the registration documents are shared. There is at least one level of harmonization. The biobank consent forms have been harmonized. And in a sense, there are increasing plans to operate as a one-stop shop even under the current system, so that, for instance, let's put it the other way around. The individuals who are in charge of the regional biobanks do not always agree on everything. One of the tasks that I have is that I am an expert member of BBMRI.fi, and the expert member is only expected to say something when there needs to be a compromise that they cannot come up with before that. I don't think I have accomplished much, but that is the only reason why I'm there. One way of trying to find, a compromise is that give everybody a task, which is one hell of a task. And so that keeps them busy so that they don't fight with each other, but try to get their own share of the national activities going as well as you can. And here are examples. The IT is obviously a very big issue, digital pathology. Then there are some specific disease entities, hospital quality registers, where Finland is much behind, for instance, Sweden. Now, as kind of an extra spin-off, which is, I have to say that I cannot really put this in place completely, that there's kind of a joint project of getting a Finnish DNA biobank of 500,000 individuals, which is sometimes referred to as the FinGene project. Let's look at the FinGene project first. This is an Anu Jalanko's slide summarizing what they have been discussing. So the aim is to get 500,000 participants, all biobanks involved, and of course this would give a really totally different setup for biobank-based research. I think here the only issue that remains to be solved is who funds it, and that is not a minor thing at all. Just 2 examples. As I said, the large population cohorts, which are quite a few in Finland, they are essentially in the hands of the National Public Health Institute, THL, which I think you all know. Also, the BBMRI LPC project, which is actually coming to an end very soon, has been coordinated by Markus Perola, again a THL-related person. And their focus has very much been in genomics, and there is a sizable amount of samples. Also, what Anu is drawing here is that they essentially send out, distribute more than 40,000 DNA aliquots each year, so it's a good size operation already. The other side is then that the hospital biobanks, and I think the one in Turku, Auria Biobank, is probably the more advanced because they were starting earlier. So they can actually provide a lot of data on what kind of material they have for different ICD codes. They can do all kinds of comorbidity studies, and they can present you a whole range of issues which I will not even try to go into. But again, I think the main challenge here is that the electronic health records in Finland are not particularly interoperable. There are two systems, and two of the university hospitals prefer the other one, and the others prefer the other one. And this interoperability or standardization is a real challenge. I think a while ago, Camilla and you also referred to the road network. I was talking to the IT people, and they said that if Europe was able to do the same with medical informatics than they did with their mobile phone system in the 1980s, which actually brought Europe as really the leader of mobile phone technology, because we had a standard in Europe which little by little became the global standard. This would really be the way to do. We may be far too diverged already, but standardization of this type of activities is probably something which would be very important. The Ministry of Social Affairs and Health, together with THL, whom they control, essentially send a clear message that the 8 biobanks is not the right solution. Could we actually set up an expert group that would consider the options of having just one biobank Finland, which would be a distributed infrastructure and serve the entire nation using similar, should I say, well, the maximally harmonized procedures, standardized or interoperable anyway. And indeed, all biobanks more or less had to agree to this one. The group, I only just want to point out that a person whom many of you know, Klaus Lindmeitner, who for a while was actually working for Pfizer. He's, I think, now more or less an independent expert. He was chairing this committee. It was not an easy one. The first group where I also belonged, we decided that we cannot really work in such a composition, so we decided simply to step down. He was the only one remained, and then they nominated another group of people who seemed to be thinking that they might actually be able to work together. The problem was that there were too many stakeholders planning for their future, and that is not an independent expert group anymore. Anyway, Klaus Lindmeitner is there, and he's still in Finland, contributing a lot to getting the whole operation going. The report was quite, I think, quite good, because it seems that this is something that could be really implemented. First of all, I think this is no big surprise that biobanking will increasingly become an integral part of the healthcare system. It's quite clear. And to realize the full value of the Finnish biobank potential, I think we could write Danish, Swedish, or Norwegian or here just as well, is to coordinate, integrate, and standardize biobanks. Establish intimate linkage between the biobank specimens, detailed electronic medical records, and other healthcare-related data. This is what we've been talking all day, isn't it? And then, thank God, dedicated funding is needed to get this whole thing going. the expert group went on to essentially propose to establish a joint legal entity of the hospital districts and universities and the other biobank owners, and essentially become Biobank Finland. This did not mean that we can abolish the local biobank activities, particularly since they are part of the healthcare system at the same time, and the custodians are the university hospitals by at least current legislation. But it would still have kind of a separate entity, a single service provider. This name is still a kind of a working name, which already has also been designated some additional funding by the ministry. The same, should I say, budgetary slot where also the Genome Center is getting funding. And so this is most likely becoming a reality, and this is what Klaus Lindmeitner is now working in Finland for another few months. The important thing is that for many years the ministry was really the one which was not particularly excited about it. Now they are becoming the driver of it, and I think this will actually mean that it all will become a reality. The funding actually to establish a joint operator or service operator probably only really materializes next year, but that's only 2 months away. Finally, so that you don't think that this is simple, there is a SISU-project. Yeah, SISU, of course, you probably know the Finnish word SISU, but this stands for Sequencing Initiative Suomi, which is essentially a researcher-driven project. But the proposals to what to do, large national cohort, genotyping, national reference database, they are very similar to what I described for the Finnish Genome Center. But this group of people, and I think if you look at their Broad, Lund, UCLA, this is very much something that Leena Peltonen created in her mind. I think Arno Palotia is one of the big drivers. Lund is there, so I would think Leif Ruup is much involved, and I don't even want to mention any other names. This is not really exactly the same as the Finnish Genome Center. Yes, this is, I think, my last, well, there's one more slide only. So I'm quite convinced that together these two initiatives probably could be materialized. The big difference between the two is that this is essentially a PPP, a public-private enterprise, because such money is not easily found in Finland, and the SISU-project people think that they could actually get some funding. This is really my final slide. It's just a nicer picture of the sequencing initiative in Finland, and I will stop here, but I hope that despite all the different bits and pieces that I tried to describe, that this might actually end up in a positive, cohesive end result. Thank you very much.
Now, thank you very much, Eero. And since you've been so economical with your time, we have time for a few questions. Yes, sir.
Maybe this is more, well, thank you very much. It's a great and very well-structured overview. Sometimes I wonder why people come up with such great ideas just out of nothing. I mean, some years ago, Danes being, I think, in many ways great individualists, they just decided that they should all contribute to common research by having this opt-out system. It's a perfect thing to do. And in Finland, all of a sudden you change the biobank law. And from one day to another, all the biobanks are accessible without consent. Who came up with these ideas, and is there anything we can learn here?
Well, I was involved in the drafting, at least particularly early versions of the biobank law, among many other things. I personally feel that the way we should, how I like to operate is that I try to really think what would be happen in the ideal world in 10 years' time for if the patient was asked a question, if we asked the medical doctor the question, if we asked the researcher the question, and if we actually asked the healthcare system, what would be the ideal situation? And then invite a few pharma people, big pharma people, to ask what would happen in the ideal world. And the funny thing is that these groups were kind of represented there. And amazingly, the end result seems to be almost the same for everybody. Patients would like to have cure based on facts, and so on and so on. The problem is that we have created a horrible network of restrictions and ethical and legal reviews to prevent this to happen. And I think trying to kind of dissolve this, and this is where the Danes are so darn good, that they just wiped out this more or less completely into a very simple and logical system. How? I don't know. In many countries, ministries have usually one or two very stubborn opinion makers who prevent things from happening. And we could take a million examples from our own countries. But at least I cannot really give credit to any single individual as such. But maybe the collective idea that we try to formulate a vision where we would like to be. And I think the Nordic countries together ought to do the same now. If we could just decide where we want to be with our 25 or 28 million inhabitants, we would be there much quicker. Mads?
This was marvelous. Biobank Finland, will that be a centralized system that you then apply to? So you don't have to go to all these other decentralized biobanks. And what about data that come out of all the analysis on the biobank material? Will you create a registry for those also with this?
Well, first of all, again, I think in the ideal world it would be quite clear that it would be a single application point. And if there were agreed principles, there would be probably some kind of a joint scientific committee, which would maybe also take standing whether ethics review is needed and what kind. I think that would be quite clear. The issue about commercial use of samples and IPR, those are obviously very complicated issues. I would think that it would be again important to come up with some very kind of general, preferably pan-European rules, but that is of course way, way out there. Was there another point yet?
The results coming out.
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, the principle of data return to these biobanks, first of all, I think this is something where I have always been extremely restricted in my ideas. I think one of the real advantages and initiatives for biobanks to give out samples is that the data is returned to them. It makes no sense to sequence the same samples 3 or 4 times, but just to have the data back and then use it for others. This holds true for all of it. Then comes, of course, the problems of how the data is delivered to the patients, how at least it ought to be known to the medical doctor, much the same way as you had your red dots for the microbial infections, that a medical doctor must know that this person carries a mutation which is potentially dangerous as a side effect of a drug treatment, for instance. I mean, these are coming more and more for the electronic health records, for sure.
All right, no more questions.
Okay.
Thank you.
Oh.
Chocolate treat.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.